It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at my website, emailrevealer.com, or at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. Or you can just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. I've got a fascinating guest today. He's an artist, incredible artwork. It's beautiful stuff. You can go to his website, owencyclops.com. He also has a Patreon at Owen Cyclops. He has a podcast as well called Owen Broadcast, and the way to catch that is to go to his Twitter page, which is owenbroadcast.com, and he also knows his name, Owen Cyclops. So, Owen, are you there?
I am here, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. We had a little trouble with the audio. Right, but we got through it. We muscled through that. Tell the audience, who is Owen Cyclops?
Yeah, well, I am mostly, I guess my primary function, the class that I occupy, you could say, is I'm an illustrator. So I do art. That's always been my main thing. And I think what makes me a little bit unique, I guess, distinguished in that area, is that I'm very interested in generally what I would call third eye, mystical, weird, paranormal topics. The arc of my journey is sort of inextricably interwoven into who I am. So I think it would be the shortest way to say it that I used to be the very stereotypical, doing a ton of psychedelics, really into New Agey, Buddhism, things like that. And then I transitioned over into being Christian after a while. And I think that gives me sort of a unique view on a lot of topics, having been really hard in that realm and then transferring over into the Christian realm. So I look at things like, society, culture, the aliens, Bigfoot, art in general, symbols in life, and how we sort of live life in these weird modern times. And that's the perspective I bring to it, having been a citizen of one island over there and then coming over to a separate shore, you could say.
And how would you describe your art?
Yeah, well, I usually call myself an illustrator as a very particular designator as opposed to a fine artist or a painter or something like that, because what an illustrator really does is they communicate and deal with ideas visually, and that's really what I do. So the artwork itself is a manifestation of me working with ideas and my own spiritual life and my ideas about things like that. And I would say that it is, if I meet someone on the street and they ask me, what kind of art I make, I normally say weird Christian art, if I had to put it in just a few words. For example, right here, I'm looking at my table, and it's covered in this print I made of these different cryptids, and there's like an angel coming down from the sky, and there's all these different weird sort of monstrous creatures. So I think the art is a manifestation of me occupying those different zones, being into these atypical topics, viewing it through a theological lens, and also being really rooted in asking questions about, what it means to be in this weird world that we're all in now, where everyone's on social media and the Pentagon is talking about UFOs, and we have all this tech, and what does it all mean, but we still kind of feel like normal people, at least I do. So my art's a manifestation of me going deeper into all the topics that I'm interested in.
And I remember you said you came from like a psychedelic background. I forget what else you said too, like bohemian, guru type stuff, and you became a Christian. What is your? How would you describe your Christianity? What the fundamentalist? What's your denomination?
Yeah, I would say that I'm. Technically speaking, I don't belong to any denomination or group. When I first became Christian, I wanted to focus more on just figuring out my own situation as opposed to like joining up with any particular group. I guess I lean a little bit more towards the perspective of what I would say like more traditional forms of Christianity. I'm into a lot of Orthodox thinkers, a lot of like classical theologians and things like that, but I don't really belong to any group. I like to clarify that there is sort of a type of Christianity that is non-denominational, and they sort of are very into not being a part of a group. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but for me, I describe it as being incidentally non-denominational. I just happen to not be a part of any group, but yeah, it's basically the story. I'm sort of a floating character right now.
And did you have like a kind of a Paul Damascus Road experience, like a sudden conversion? Describe that.
Yeah, a little bit. I think it's really unexpected for people in some ways, but there is an archetype of someone who goes really far down the road of occultism and being into magic and these weird topics that eventually leads them into Christianity. It seems like it would be the most unintuitive connection ever. But that archetype does exist, and I do see myself as a part of that. I think you could explain it as, part of the draw of these weird esoteric spiritual paths and psychedelics and things like that is it feels like you're out in the field doing research. And I like to describe it as, sort of all my research unexpectedly led me to the conclusion of studying God and Christianity and things like that. It wasn't really one moment. It honestly was a little bit more like stumbling into a kind of conspiracy theory or something where I'm stacking up these cards and I'm looking at the evidence. And eventually I reached this point where I was looking at all this evidence and I thought, I kind of have to be a little dumb to think this is just all a total coincidence. So it wasn't really one moment. A lot of it was falling out with different things. I used to be really, really into psychedelics, and that was what all my art was about. I fell out of that. I used to be really into Buddhism, and eventually they led me to certain questions that led me directly to Christianity. So it's more of like a 1, 2, 3 step process.
So now, do you believe in the baptism of the Holy Spirit, the gifts, the spiritual gifts of tongues and prophecy and healing?
Yeah, I would say. Well, in a sense, there's a lot of things there. I mean, in a sense, yeah. I definitely believe in like the Holy Spirit and things like that. If you're talking about like speaking in tongues, that's a whole sort of like separate realm. But I don't do that. I don't really look down on it, but it's not really a part of my worldview, I would say.
And what about prophecy and words of knowledge, stuff like that?
Prophecy and things like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of my vibe, I would say, is that I think people generally tend to view life as separated. There's a sort of a large barrier between the mundane and then the spiritual. And for me, a lot of the process of me developing and going deeper into these topics has been breaking down that wall. So, yeah, I really do think that, I actually believe in, like, divinity and things like that, and I think it intersects with real everyday life for sure.
Definitely. Now, what about now? Do you still use any kind of psychedelics or marijuana, anything now?
No, I don't. I think a big part of my general thesis, I guess you could say, I think the person that, set us up with each other, they read something I wrote that was all about DMT and psychedelics. And eventually I came to the conclusion that there is this larger, nefarious, unseen aspect to it operating under the surface. So I sort of naturally fell out of it, and then I really took a total 180 turn on it. If you told me, 10 years ago that I don't want to say I'm anti it. Saying anti makes it sound like you have like an irrational bias. But if you told me, 10 years ago that I would be talking to people sometimes about how I think there is this sort of darker, larger force at play via psychedelics and things like that, I would have been really surprised. But that's the conclusion I came to, yeah.
Now, the darker force you speak of, is this like the government, the MK Ultra programs and that kind of stuff? There's so many people, you know what I mean? Like so many people talk about how the LSD movement, like all these guys were a bunch of spooks that ran that all that stuff, and agents and all kind of provocateurs and such. Or you're talking about like a darker evil force that's behind it?
Yeah, so there is the whole, alphabet intelligence agencies, MK Ultra and stuff like that. Some people are really into that. For me, and I think part of what drew a lot of attention to me online initially, is that for me, I think there's certain connections that seem very unintuitive, but once you make them, they actually seem sort of obvious. So for me, when I say darker forces, I'm thinking more like spiritual forces and things like that. For example, I think that a lot of attention got drawn to me. I sort of had this whole thing I wrote that was about how all these different phenomenon that seem totally, completely separate are actually interlinked. And I really got the idea from someone named Seraphim Rose. He's an Orthodox monk. He was around in the 70s, And in my opinion, he was way ahead of the curve. He really saw everything coming, 100 miles away. In fact, if you even read him now, it still seems like he's still ahead of the curve. And he has a book that I'd highly recommend. It's called Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. And he goes through all these different topics like New Age stuff, UFOs, you mentioned speaking in tongues, all these different things, mostly like New Age stuff, UFOs, science fiction, things like that. And he views them from this Christian perspective. And when I first got exposed to him, it really blew my world wide open because I realized there were these underlying connections between these things that I had never considered. The easiest way to step into it, in my opinion, is really with the UFO thing. A lot of people listening to this will obviously be familiar with UFOs, things like that. In fact, there's sort of a new wave of it with the government saying, oh, actually, we're releasing these videos, the Pentagon releasing videos about UFOs. If you trust the Pentagon, that's up to you, but they are releasing these videos, whatever they actually are. And I think the UFO thing is the best step into it in a way because people have all these questions, what is it? Is it a hallucination? Is it just, are they actually aliens from other worlds or something like that? But what really started the cascade for me was Seraphim Rose says that the UFOs are obviously somewhat of a spiritual phenomenon, that they're not strictly these metal crafts literally landing on people's lawns, that the UFO phenomenon is an extension of this phenomenon of human beings encountering these strange, semi-spiritual creatures throughout history. And at first, it seemed like a really unintuitive connection to me. I thought, what does UFOs have to do with demons and stuff like that? What are you talking about? But as I went further into it, it really became the most plausible explanation for me. And that cascaded into all these other topics that I was into also, seeing them through a spiritual lens and realizing that they have a spiritual dimension to them.
And that's interesting. Because then, what do you make then of the government releasing these military videos now? And like you said, not that we could trust the military, because we know, Colonel Michael Aquino was the head of the Templar set, and he was high up in the American military, running these psychological warfare operations. What do you make?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Honestly, I really don't know what to make of it because on the surface level, I have to look at anything that they are releasing through some lens of skepticism, in the sense that I think when they release documents, a lot of the time the air they give them, the sort of facade is oh, well, the box was checked and now we just have to release this, so check it out. Now it's on the news, but obviously I think everyone knows that's not the case. If anything's released, it's with some level of intentionality. But beyond that, I really couldn't say specifically in terms of why now and why specific agencies or groups are releasing it, but for me it's hooked back into a larger cultural shift. When I look at UFOs in and of themselves, this is a good example of it, but it works for a lot of topics. I really see them in terms of this whole worldview shift, and I think that UFOs play a really interesting role in that. In that it sort of represents this turn towards this kind of slightly atheistic, but also semi-New Age, scientific-y worldview that is almost like the default. That's why it's a little bit difficult to talk about the worldview as a whole because, fish doesn't realize the water it swims in. But it's almost like the worldview is permeated by this strange blend of New Age, science, occultism, maybe transhumanism is in there also. And I see UFOs as, whether intentional or not, another chip stacked to shift things in that direction. So that just makes it more perplexing that, then the government would be also releasing these videos. But I couldn't say specifically why.
Well, the one thing we can be sure is we can't trust the government. And the other is that whole field seems to attract a bunch of hoaxers and con men and just, I guess because a lot of the people who do want to believe in all kind of weird stuff are more gullible than the average person. And it just attracts these predators that goes out after these people. On the Owen broadcast, what other kind of topics do you cover on the Owen broadcast?
I talk about art and things like that, and symbolism, and sort of the way that symbols and symbolic thinking relate to life in general, how we live. It sounds very ambiguous, but I suppose what I mean is that a lot of the show that I do on YouTube, I do a YouTube show also,
right?
Is I do a painting show, and I'm painting and talking about it and things like that. And I think oddly it does actually sync up with all this other stuff because there really is this symbolic dimension to life that not that many people are aware of.